All right. My name is Lamont Adu. I'm a professor of Romance Studies and co-director and founder of the From Slavery to Freedom Lab. And it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you here tonight for our inaugural Masterclass series. We could not be more delighted, more honored to have one of the foremost thinkers, critics, provocateurs of our time, and I'm not exaggerating. Rinaldo Walcott has been one of my favorite scholars for a very long time, and when we were conceiving of this series, I couldn't have thought of anyone. He was at the top of my list to invite to Duke, and we were so excited that he accepted our invitation. I'm so excited that you all will have come out to share in what will be, I'm certain, a wonderful evening of stimulating conversation and dialogue. I'm just going to quickly read Professor Walcott's bio, even though all of you are big fans as I am. But Professor Walcott is professor and chair of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo. He holds the Carl V. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies. He is a writer and critic. His research is in the area of Black Diaspora Cultural Studies, gender and sexuality, with interests in nations, nationalisms, multiculturalism, policy, and education broadly defined. As an interdisciplinary Black Studies scholar, Walcott has published in a range of venues on everything from literature to film, to theater, to music, to policy. His articles have appeared in scholarly journals and books, as well as in popular venues like newspapers and magazines and media online sources. He often comments on Black cultural life for radio and TV. Walcott has edited or co-edited multiple books, including Rude, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism. I remember reading that one. Walcott is also the author of a book that I'm sure we all have read, Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, with a second revised version that came out in 1997, with a second revised version that came out in 2003. He is also the author of Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora, and Black Studies, a co-author of Black Life, Post-BLM, and Struggle for Freedom. And in 2021, he published The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Freedom, and most recently, On Property, Policing Prisons and the Call for Abolition. So I would like to, I'll stop right there, and I will just say that tonight, Professor Walcott will be inaugurating this series, and we are so, again, deeply honored to have him here. And so without further ado, I will pass the mic to the man that we have come to learn from. And thank you so much, Professor Walcott.
Thank you. So, thank you, Dr. Aidu, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, Barbara Ofosu Somaya, for all of the wonderful work and hosting you have been doing. Barbara is a go-getter. Yeah, she's a force to reckon with. Trust me. And she will be an intellectual force to reckon with. So thank you to the From Slavery to Freedom Lab for inviting me. I feel like this is a big task, and Professor Aidu told me that we should be casual and so on. But I live in fear of the casual. So if at some point you see me open up my computer, it's because I'm trying to find like one of the essays where I'm thinking through some of these questions to be a little bit more focused or to try to say something more pointedly. But what I want to do this afternoon is to cycle through 4 moments. There are 4 moments that I keep coming back to in the work that I'm doing now, but in the work that I've done in the past. But I think I'm at a period where I'm able to be, I guess, more precise in noticing that these are moments that I've been coming back to for over 2 decades. And now I'm kind of much more clearly codifying them in the work that I'm doing as I move forward. The first is thinking about the question of humanism and its problem for Black life. The second is that for over 2 decades, I have been deeply influenced by the work of the the poet, essay, and novelist Dion Brand. And the third is thinking about questions of reparation. Um, I wrote my first essay on reparations in the late 1990s. It was published around 2000. And then I kind of left that work behind and went to other things. And I've come back to the question of reparations, most recently with an article published in the Journal of Philosophy of Race, and some more work that I'm doing on reparations. And the fourth is the question of freedom. So freedom, in some ways, had been the first question that I began thinking about. What does it mean to be black, for black people to be free in the world? And and as the years have progressed, I've realized that that is not an easy answer to arrive at. But it seems to me that to arrive at it, we have to go through the question of humanism. So, in the Long Emancipation, one of the things that I try to do in that book is to think about the problem of humanism for black people. And of course, in black studies right now, there's a wide ranging debate on the question of humanism. Whether or not black people are human, subhuman, whether or not the category is a category that's worth wrestling with, whether or not it's a category that needs recuperation, and so on. One of the ways that I dealt with the kind of question of humanism in the Long Emancipation was to turn to the work of Sylvia Wynter, the Caribbean intellectual and philosopher. I like to think of her as the philosopher of the Americas. And of course, Wynter's work builds from and extends Fanon's inquiry into the problem of the human by pointing towards what Fanon asks us to at the end of Black Skin, White Mask. Take a leap of invention into a new humanism. But Wynter doesn't just simply narrate what might be a new humanism. What Wynter does is she takes us through the historical and ideological production of European humanism as a particular form of violence that gets enacted on all the rest of us. And in so doing, what she does is she writes a history of a history and a theoretical treatise of European humanism and why it is something that we will have to reckon with if we are to be able to make a different world where all life forms, as I call them in the Long Emancipation, are able to live the fullest possible lives. So in the Long Emancipation, I sidestep the question of humanism. Not really sidestep the question. I halt at the question of humanism, and I use the term the black life form as a way not to particularly delve into the debate around who and what might constitute the category of the human. So in that work, I give the category of the human to Europe, and I think of black people as a life form that sits in relationship to Euro-American, European humanism. But of course, that's not the beginning and end of the question for me. In much of my work, I'm thinking with Wynter alongside the Caribbean intellectual, historian, and poet, Kamal Brathwaite. In particular, I'm interested in Kamal Brathwaite's articulations of what he calls the literature and the culture of catastrophe that is produced out of the context of Caribbean enslavement, the near genocide of indigenous peoples in the archipelago, and the ongoing immiseration of lives in that region. And so for me, when I bring Wynter and Brathwaite into conversation, something quite interesting emerges. And And what emerges is that within the context of the degradations that constitute Black life in the Americas, it's alongside those degradations is the tremendous possibility of invention. And so for me, the kind of question of what can't European humanism account for in Black life is Black invention. And in fact, what I suggest in the Long Emancipation, that everywhere that Black invention emerges, Euro-American legislative practices attempt to curtail it, criminalize it, and ultimately attempts to kill it. So that even extends to the killing of the Black body. That Black people would make a claim to owning their bodies is a strike against European humanism. That Black people would make a claim to owning their bodies is, in many ways, an invented refusal of European humanism. A humanism that Black people could never actually, anyhow, live up to because it was not conceived with them in mind. In fact, it was decidedly conceived to exclude what we might call the Black subject. So the question of humanism, European universality, is one that is fundamental and central to my thinking and girds what I've been trying to do for 2 decades or more now. And for me then, what Caribbean intellectual thought, or when I turn to Caribbean intellectual thought, I'm trying to think the archipelago and its extensions. And extensions is a term that I borrow from Edward Glissant, because the Caribbean archipelago is not just that geography. It is movement in and out of the region, and it extends well beyond the Americas. So when I think about that invention, I think about the manner and the form and the shape in which Black movement beyond the archipelago reshapes global relations. So in the Long Emancipation, I talk about how when Black people move, the nation state comes into crisis, right? We see this at the Mexico-U.S. border. We see this at the Canada-U.S. border. We see this with Africans crossing the Mediterranean. When Black people move, the nation state comes into crisis. And as the French Martinican thinker Aimé Césaire so long ago pointed out in Discourse on Colonialism, that Europe invented 2 things: man, which is humanism, which is European humanism, and the nation state. And then Césaire goes on to say, and both of them are something that we have to leap beyond. Both of them is something that we have to dissolve. And why? Because both of them are riveted by violence. They only make sense in the context of the tremendous imposition of forms of violence. So that's the first thing that I want to kind of just briefly and casually lay out for you. But in Dion Brand's, particularly the map to the door of no return, a lot of what I just said about humanism becomes articulated in that text. A text that many people misread as a kind of memoir because it begins with a family story of her trying to goad her grandfather into saying the name of the people that they come from, and him not being able to remember that name. But it's not a memoir. It's an exercise in thinking the Black diaspora and its various permutations, and the manner in which the Black diaspora is both constrained by the violences of Euro-American humanism and a site of invention through music, dance, everyday ordinariness, sports, and so on. So I've known Dion Brand personally for over 2 decades. And I've spent many, many, many hours writing speaking with her, writing about her work, reading her work. But it's only really quite recently that I've come to realize what a profound influence her work has had on my own thinking over those 2 decades. So, in 2021, Christina Sharp organized a conference called MAP at 20. And in that conference, of which you can find the proceedings online on York University's YouTube channel. In that conference, I was asked to think about MAP and what it might offer us. And as I returned to the work, so I wrote a paper called Longing Across the Black Diaspora, Love, Being, and the Door of No Return. And there were 2 things I wanted to do in that paper, which was to think about the question of black being, again, so you can see how this question of humanism returns to me in different kinds of ways, to think about the question of black being, but also to think about the question of longing. Knowing where this book begins with the grandfather's inability to say where did people come from, and the child beyond longing for an answer to this question: where did your people come from? And one of the things that I noticed as I reread that book, that I had read almost every year for the last 20 years and taught numerous times, one of the things that I noticed as I read the book is that the kind of black diaspora subjectivity that Dion Brand maps in the Map of the Door of No Return is not a subjectivity that is subtended by a notion of grief or loss. She gives us another kind or form. Is that my phone? Okay. Sorry, yeah. It's because, yeah, it's going to go off on my computer. Yeah. She gives us another sense of the melancholic. So black people don't get stuck in the Freudian melancholy. In fact, in every moment that grief and loss occurs to black people, it vaunts them into another moment of invention, into self-invention, into musical invention, into new bodily forms of comportment, and so on. And so, one of the things that Brand's work made me begin to think about is whether or not the black diaspora already preceded Freud in having a different orientation to the question of grief and mourning that Freud could simply not approach, because Freud could not account for in his work, despite his numerous correspondences and so on, with the question of the Middle Passage. Right? So I first came, as I said at the beginning, I wrote my first essay thinking about reparations at the end of the 1990s. And at that point in time, I'd finished graduate school a few years prior, and I had embarked on a project to think about the memory and history of the Middle Passage in artistic work. I want to think about how it was that the Middle Passage as a void, as a historical void, seemed almost impossible to represent. But yet, black artists attempted it, and attempted that representation. But it was for the celebration of this 20th anniversary of the writing, the Map to the Door of No Return, that I returned to questions of trauma and grief and loss across the black diaspora, to kind of think about how black people do not become stuck in grief and melancholia. Because if we were stuck in grief and melancholia, we would not be able to, for lack of a better term, achieve the kinds of things that we have achieved. So, this question of invention then remained for me, or has been important to me in terms of understanding how Black people's sense of being moves from and across into a kind of another state, another way of experiencing the world. It led me to think then that the kind of collective trauma that constitutes the Black diaspora is not so much a trauma in need of repair, but rather it is a trauma that leads to invention. And when I got to that point, it suddenly dawned on me that what I was writing and thinking with via Dion Brand's work might amount to an argument against reparations. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But what would that mean, that it might amount to an argument against reparations? Let me first say that what Dion Brand offers us is an unremitting undoing of European humanism and an account of Black life and invention in the face of ongoing forms of violence and degradation. And that in and of itself tells you that at stake is a kind of different form of being, right? But it also tells you something about what doesn't get distinguished in the context of the brutalities of transatlantic slavery and its ongoing aftermath, which is a particular kind of desire. So, as of course, in the humanities and social sciences, we know that Sigmund Freud is the most significant theorist of desire. But again, I would argue that there's something about Black desire that slips out of the psychoanalytic understanding of what constitutes desire. Okay. Let me read something from Brand. Brand tells her readers, and I quote, "I want to say something about desire. I really do not know what it is." And then she proceeds to write against a world filled, quote, with commodified desire. And then she tells us of desire. Quote, "I wanted to talk about it as it is sold to us. Not as it is sold to us, I'm sorry, but as one collects it, piece by piece, proceeding through a life. I want to say that life, if we are lucky, is a collection of aesthetic experiences, which may be one and the same sometimes, and which, if we are lucky, we make a sense of. Making sense may be what desire is, or putting the senses back together." Right? So that's a kind of, the last two moments there is a kind of profound orientation to a different sense of being. That, the catastrophe, the degradations require that Black life be attentive to all that surrounds it. That Black life makes sense out of something that for others would be no sense at all. That Black life finds within those degradations a desire to put things back together again. And so it's this putting things back together again that I call the life form, the Black life form. And that putting of things back together again comes in all kinds of ways. But this question of the human, and particularly European humanism, which Europeans have made universal. So they took their own partial sense of what it meant to be human and made it the universal standard that we should all attempt to achieve, and therefore many of us fail at, including many Europeans themselves, many Euro-Americans, right? This is not a project that that is necessarily attainable, but it's one that is so deeply implanted in us that we keep striving to achieve it, and we obviously fail. And indeed, that is why I think Freud's psychoanalytic take and invention and interventions remain so important, despite the claim that I made earlier about black desire and black longing preceding Freud in a certain kind of way that he couldn't think it. And this in some ways then brings me to this kind of question of reparations. I've been thinking a lot about reparations in relationship to the question not of the economization of the degradations done to black people. I think that there's a way in which to conceive of reparations through an economized or a kind of arithmetics of life is a limited and limiting relationship to reparations. But that logic of reparations is what has taken hold today, whether here in the USA or in the Anglo-Caribbean. The calculation of black life and loss, historical and contemporary, is what's being offered up as reparations. I don't really want to think about reparations then as about the question of subjecthood. Because it seems to me, and for people who are committed to a logic of reparations that's an arithmetized or economized reparations, they would hear in my comments a kind of refusal of reparations. So let me say at the pragmatic level. I'm like, if people are going to give you money for what occurred in the past, you take that money. We've seen that with Jewish reparations for the Shoah. We've seen it in Canada and the US with reparations for Japanese internments and so on. So this is not, that's over there. How one reckons with that is up to, the nature of how those disbursements happen. But can those disbursements, if you will, repair, heal, or transform the fundamental kinds of losses that transatlantic slave trade, plantation slavery induced into black life? And the reason I came to the kind of question, reading Dion Brand again, that the argument I was making amounted to a kind of critique of reparations, is because it is exactly the manner in which she is able to write Black Desire and Invention that already seems to foreclose a conversation about what reparations might be. Which is to say that if one story of reparations is about making people whole, that black people, being people of reinvention continuously, are already whole. We are already whole, right? So an argument around reparations as making us whole is not one that we necessarily need. But I do think there's something else at stake, and I think what I think is at stake is the question of reparations as a psychic and cultural circumstances beyond the economized, beyond the arithmetized. And it is that question alongside a different notion of value beyond the value imputed by capitalism that becomes at stake, right? And therefore, this kind of logic and thinking asks us to think both inside of capitalism and its social organization, and to think beyond it, or to, if you will, keep in an antagonistic relation of refusal to it. Economize, arithmetize, reparations are not in opposition to capital. In fact, they rely on the persistence and the repetition of capital to make their claim. If capital disappeared, there would be no need to make that claim, that economized claim. And indeed, um, such a claim, if executed, does not change the other relations to blackness that already exist in the world. So the question of subjectivity, of psychic relations, to put it in these stark terms for both the black and the white, still remain at stake if economized reparations were to occur. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and it has taken me back to psychoanalysis and thinking about the manner in which the black, I'm going to use this, but I'm thinking typologically when I say the black psychic structure works to the extent that we continue to make lives. What does it mean to continue to make lives within the midst of ongoing brutality, vulgar forms of our death, where we're shot in the back as we're running away, where we're pushed out of neighborhoods that we have lived in for 150 years, where in the region that I come from in the Caribbean, people are every year pushed further and further into poverty, and yet we make lives. Reparations, as presently constituted, doesn't have an answer for that question. It simply does not. And so, I don't have an answer yet either, but it's something that I'm trying to work with and think through and to make sense of. And of course, Winter, Kamal Braffett, Toni Morrison, a number of black intellectuals and thinkers, I think beyond Brand, I think offer us some keys into that. When Morrison in Plain in the Dark tells us that European humanism is always caught up in some process of conquest, she's actually telling us that one way to think about freedom is to refuse the logic of conquest, refuse the logic of domination, right? So these are pathways towards thinking about freedom and its possibilities. And so, for me then, this kind of, how might we think about ongoing forms of violence, networked, constituted, sedimentary forms of violence that we are both inducted into, become subject of, and explain as the kind of banal everyday. We keep developing languages for these things, microaggressions and so on and so forth. But really, they're the structural violences of our lives. And they can be vulgar, like a shot in the head or the back from the police, or they can seem banal, like, oh, there are no black people or indigenous people around, but it's always been like that. Let me know it's not, right? So these are violences along a range of forms. So we know within the context then of thinking about reparations beyond the economized, that the other thing that becomes important to reparations are usually some mold, some form of an apology. Now, apologies hold an interesting kind of possibility because apologies seem to be a part of a reparative process, seem to be a part of repair. But of course, apologies have to be, again, if they're going to be useful and make sense and be in a project of some kind of project of transformation, the apology has to do something beyond recalling the past injury. It has to be able to inaugurate some kind of transformational change in which all of the players affected, those receiving the apology and those giving the apology, move forward differently. But what we have actually seen with apologies in the context of reparations, whether it's for um, the Shoah, whether it's for colonization of indigenous peoples, whether it's for reparations for internments and so on, is that apologies premised within the logics of Euro-American humanism are also premised within the logic that the people being apologized to will enter that category. So most apologies end up failing, especially to indigenous people and Japanese Americans, Japanese Canadians, because they simply cannot enter a category that was constructed on the belief of their lack of humanness. So most apologies in the context of reparations fail. They fail to do the thing that they're meant to do. So that's one stop. Let me think here. Where do I want to go? Okay. So I'll say one last thing about reparations, and then I'll move to freedom, and then we can open it up. So then what becomes at stake, it seems to me, is the question of interiorities. How do we think Black interior life? What constitutes Black interior life? What does it mean to think about the interiority of Black life, both in relationship to the violences that surround it and constitute it, and the excess of that? So, and part of my argument is, or part of my suggestion is, that we have not been able to adequately think Black interior life. That in fact, most often our response to Black life is to sociologize it, is to anthropologize it. Therefore, we're always reading Black life as surface life, right? We've not been able to grapple with the interiority of Black life in any substantive way. Sylvia Winter, in trying to think about this through thinking the Black novel and so on, called in one of her essays on Disenchanting Discourse, she called for what she described as the counter novel. And I've been thinking a lot about Winter's notion of the counter novel. And what I've come to is what I call, following Winter, a kind of counter imaginary, which is to say that, or to argue that, Black intellectuals, artists, writers find ourselves tasked with having to figure out not only a past and a present that seeks to make us null and void in a certain kind of way, but we also have to figure out or imagine new forms of social life, new forms of social habitation. And those new forms of social life or new forms of habitation are what I call freedom. So that I try to untether freedom from anything like representative democracy, freedom from even the idea of European captivity, freedom as a set of rights, any of that kind of thing. For me, and I suggest this in the Long Emancipation, and now as I'm trying to work towards this book on freedom in the sea. But freedom is about bodily autonomy. It exceeds political and national sovereignties. And it's about being able to exist in a world free of forms of domination, violence, and modes of conduct that continue to ask you to steal yourself from yourself. So freedom is a kind of reckoning with a certain kind of interiority of how we want to experience the world and how we should be able to experience the world. Which is to say that freedom is a kind of open possibility without guarantees, to riff off of Stuart Hall, of what a life, of what and how a life might be lived. The thing about this, though, is that it's risky, right? Because it doesn't leave the history of various violences behind. So this is why I'm working towards a book on utopia as well, because I want to think about what it means to imagine and risk inventing new worlds, knowing the history that we um, that we are faced with. One last thing I'll say before I shut up, which is this: I'm thinking all of these things, not just with Winter, Brand, Brathwaite, and so on, but with people like Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moulton, David Marriott, Christina Sharp, and others. And I'm also returning to, the work of the slave narratives, particularly Olaudah Equiano, to think about how it is that these folks wrote about freedom. So some folks from last night would know I was making the point that if we read Equiano's narrative, not as a narrative as escape from as escape from captivity, but as a narrative that begins with he had a different experience of freedom before he was captured. That was even different from the kind of experience of freedom that he has after captivity. Because of course, his what we would now call his African subjectivity prior to captivity had already in it an account of freedom. Then something else emerges for us. And David Marriott in writing about Frantz Fanon, and this is where I'm going to end with David's words. He says about Fanon and freedom. He says, I became completely convinced that Fanon wishes the colonized to be absolutely free, but that this is a freedom that has nothing to do with political sovereignty. Instead, for Fanon, each citizen should stand on their own feet and be able to look the enemy in the eye without trembling. Unquote. So, what David is getting at there is that freedom exists beyond these invented structures that continue to order the world through the partial logic of European humanism, through man and the nation state. I'll stop there. I hope that made sense.
I guess all throughout your talk, I was thinking about an earlier essay of yours, where that, of course, I'm forgetting the name of it, which is bad behavior, but where you talk about the ethic of care in relation to Black death, and that particular essay kind of ends by opening onto Marlon Riggs's "Black is, Black ain't." And I'm also thinking about moments in Dion Brand's work with the recent novel Theory, where lesbianism is kind of more front and center, and then reaching on the way back to No Language is Neutral, thinking about lesbianism. And it just seemed, thinking throughout your talk, that, and also thinking to Long Emancipation and things like funk ethics, and sag and pants, those parts of the conversation in this essay, that sexuality continues to sort of have a role to play in the conversation about how you're trying to think about freedom. And yeah, I guess not a question, but a comment of it seems that gender and sexuality seem to remain, they're both really burdened, right, in the context of thinking about Blackness as exclusion from the human, and yet CC, the inventiveness question, it seems that these questions of Black invention through gender and sexual practices are still really live in the things that you're thinking about now, and also seem like something that we could always be returning to in Brand's work. That I'll say, I personally, as someone who's a scholar of Black lesbianism and HIV, I was like, oh, we could be talking about Brand's lesbianism still in productive in different ways. So yeah, gender and sexuality is something that seems really live in this work.
Most definitely. I mean, of course, because winter is such an influence on me. There are moments in my work where I've been like very focused on writing about Black gay men in particular and questions of sexuality. But winter's influence on my thinking, where gender is genre rather than category, has really kind of switched things up for me in significant ways. Um, but I think where when I say that I've been in this conversation with Dion Brand and I didn't like, even realize it, is to say that, for instance, what in the 90s we would have called the Banji boy, and in our era now, which we turn to the fam, what we see the Black life form doing with the category of gender is genre in it, right? That what Black people are not inventing new categories of gender. They're always showing that there's this kind of unfolding of gender as this genre of beingness, right? And so, of course, there are many things that allow that to happen. Many kinds of, if you will, social innovations or cultural turns that allow us to move from, the kind of cis gay man or lesbian to the banshee boy to now the femme. And in each of these languages, there's a kind of different form of being that unfolds. And again, what we see is that in each of those moments, the Black subject does not just offer a counter, but they offer a radically different imagination of what other people think or are experiencing as categories, right? So I didn't fully develop this idea about the counter imaginary, where I'm trying to transform Winter's counter novel into a counter imaginary. But part of what I'm trying to stumble towards there is this question of what's going on in our heads? What's going on in Black interior life that we are willing to risk so much? Because we know that the Banji boy and the fam are not just risking it in their local community, where sometimes they gotta literally run for their life, but they're risking it all for another account of what we might call gender or what we might call sexuality, right? And so we've seen this across historical time, whether it is the lesbian, the gay man, Audre Lorde, Essex Hemphill, right, and into our present time. There's something there that I don't think arithmetize, economize narratives of the degradation of Black life can help us account for. And that's in part what I'm grappling with. Yeah.
That's so helpful.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you ended talking about Equiano's slave narrative, and I'm thinking about the individuals who, unlike Equiano, didn't necessarily have any experience of freedom before captivity had been like drawn upon. And this is from like Marinage all the way up to our contemporary moment of like resistance um, in the streets from police brutality and violence. I think there's been this sort of like freedom produced by Black life and Black creativity, like you were talking about in your talk, that pushes up against Western humanism that doesn't necessarily come from a direct experience with freedom before Western humanism. And I'm also thinking about, we read Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens with Nash, and I think Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. They're both trying to get towards this like thing where they're trying to figure out like how that freedom is passed down without directly having like an experience with sort of freedom
Mhm.
before colonization. So I was just wondering what you thought about like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There are kind of two things to consider. I'm not a historian, but one of the things that we have to consider when when we when we think about marriage and we think about slavery, then different, like, in the U.S. and the place where I was born, Barbados, there's an interesting moment because at a certain point in these societies, the slaves are reproducing themselves. But in places like Brazil and Cuba, the slavery is so harsh that it's being replenished all the time. So, so quote unquote, the Africans who are arriving in those places are coming with a different epistemological understanding of the world. Because they're coming with a sense of the world that exists prior to slavery. And that's something that I don't think that we've made good sense of, even as we get these wonderful and amazing histories. But also thinking about the question. Sorry, all of a sudden the allergies got me. But thinking about this kind of question of interiority, right? What all the slave communities had was the what someone like Morse would call story, the passing on of the story, the passing on of another time. So even though one might have been second or third or fourth generation born into slavery, one still has those stories. So this kind of question of the interiority of Black life, the brutality of slavery does not or cannot actually extinguish that. And so, you know, um, a kind of desire then for something, another state of being, so to speak, the pun off of that, remains alive among the captives. Now, at the end of the Long Emancipation, you will, however, see that I make an argument around marriage, in which I say, like, marriage is not freedom. Marriage is not freedom because maroon communities are encircled by unfreedom. Everywhere that maroon communities exist, they are encircled by unfreedom. And the most successful ones that we've come to know made all kinds of deals with plantation economy and colonizing forces so they could survive, including returning other runaways at a certain point. So I understand the contemporary attraction to marriage as um, a kind of stand-in for freedom. But for me, the question of freedom that really animates my thinking is to turn to the Haitian Revolution. Because what we see in the long jury is that when Black people really assert the possibility of freedom, what happens is the tremendous, unrelenting violence of European humanism, which is, you can read Haiti from the revolution to now as constituting that. While, whether it's, the Maroon communities in the cockpit or the Quilombos in Brazil, they're now in some ways kind of celebrated, right? Of course, they're still structured by tremendous forms of nation state violence, but not in the same way that Haiti is this entity um, continues to experience the long jury of Euro American violence. So I think marriage as a practice, I think Maroon communities are really fundamentally important to helping us to think about freedom as something beyond a practice, beyond a practice and the making of community and a staking out of a geography. Um, and I mean, like the way in which I'm thinking, this is debatable. We can debate this because you know, um, but that's where as I've tried to read the history of of maroon communities, to think about them, and to think about them in relationship to places like small places like Barbados, where it was impossible for maroon communities to really take hold, right? They're too small, they're too flat. There's not, there's not a lot of swamps, mangroves, these kinds of things. And yet, those places had so many uprisings for people to free themselves, right? Or come into another state of being. Yeah. So these are some things that I think our work needs to keep probing at and pushing at.
I'm Antonia. Thank you so much for this jam-packed laying out of all your current thoughts, Ronaldo. One thing I was thinking about as you talk about interiority, oh, should I put this back? Anyway, which is my one of my current interests was the in your response to Quell, I was thinking about the book Yabo by Alexis DeVoe, and there's Yabo has several different stories in it, and one of the stories is about these enslaved women on the ship, um, and how they're being how that one of the men on the ship are trying to sexually violate them, and they know that there's no escape of it from the ship, so they just make out with each other, and what I thought about as we responded to Quell was this idea of freedom having to be long lasting. But there's a freedom of making out with people like that, because also you were talking about freedom as determination over your body, and even when there's no hope of escaping, there's a freedom of I'm going to kiss the woman next to me and fuck you. Oh, can I say that? I just said that. So just if you could talk about the temporality of freedom and your understanding, especially as it relates to interiority.
That's a great question, and a great insight. I don't think I've read that one by Alexis DeVoe yet. But in the Long Emancipation, I write about the glimpses of freedom. That, for instance, the way a black person might hold their body can offer you a glimpse of freedom. Um, I knew sagging pants is one of those moments where you get a glimpse of freedom, which is to say that black people entirely reauthor how wearing a pants should look like. And because it's a glimpse of freedom, it becomes criminalized. You know, I knew funk music as a glimpse of freedom. Hip hop is a glimpse of freedom. But then what happens is it becomes commoditized. So its potential to launch into something else becomes curtailed. So yes, there's a temporality to freedom, and it's again, I think all of those moments add up to something profound. And the kind of question that I'm struck with in this particular time is what kind of intellectual risks one can take to try to name them, to give them some kind of contour without disciplining them into a political program. Because this is where you get laughed out of the room after 1989, the collapse of communism, right? There's only one way of being in the world right now, and that's the triumph of the Western capitalist model. There are no alternatives, so, but they are. And the kind of question is like, how not to discipline these things into a hard and rigid program. For those of us who've been in Black studies for a long time, we went through the can Black people be postmodern debates right alongside the debates on Afrocentricity, and both sides seem to offer up, a kind of program, if you will, the Henry Louis Gates model of, we're all different, but we're all the same. That's now so deeply embedded in his DNA show. Or the Asante model of the temple, the Afrocentric model, where, we had to recapture our past lost selves, and, homosexuality became, something that was imported into Black life and so on. And so, if you're a student of those kinds of debates, you want to resist that kind of programmatic nature to Black life. And indeed, I would argue that what we would call everyday Black people resist that programmatic experience all the time, which is why everyday Black people also experience the most tremendous forms of vulgar violence. The shot in the head or the back as they run away from the police, you know, tremendous levels of poverty, terrible health care, education, and so on, because they're not moving in the rhythm of that particular kind of discipline routine. And the minute that you don't do that, you open up a whole new array of possibilities. And the violence is meant to discipline you back into. So, great insight. Um, it resonates with me. Yeah.
So moving towards Black freedom involves in many ways like this kind of, it's an anti-disciplinary kind of thing. But then I have this question, in part thinking in the background of like how Black studies is unfolding in Canada, like how the kind of institutional project appears to be unfolding in Canada, and knowing, just thinking back to like your essay in E. Patrick's book, thinking about Black Canada as Black queer studies had its moment of kind of becoming programmatic. And then in this, in this essay, this moment of like the new future for Black studies, I guess I have this question about, I have a few questions, some of like, what's the tea on the, the institutional project of Black studies in Canada, and your thoughts about that. But also, given that this project is about a kind of anti-disciplinary impulse, do you have thoughts, hopes, feelings, observations about how your project is being taken up in Black studies as it looks like here in the US or in Canada, or thinking, are they talking about this book at UWI, like, in the Caribbean, like, just like, but, just like, given what some of the implications of your thought are for disciplinarity, like what are your hopes in terms of how it gets taken up for those of us who are moving through these kinds of negotiations of disciplinarity and the kind of anti-disciplinary or institutional impulse?
That's such a great question. And it's a great question for all kinds of reasons. But just let me say that I've been, what's the word I'm looking for? I've been kind of buoyed by the places that the Long Emancipation has resonated, and the places where there's been no kind of acknowledgement that it even exists. So, I finished writing the book, and then May 2020 happened. The book comes out in 2021. And one of the things that happened after May 2020 is that a lot of Canadian institutions started immediately establishing some form of Black studies, whether it's certificate programs or Black studies minors, and so on.
Cluster hires?
Pardon me?
Cluster hires?
Mm-hmm. All of those kinds of things. There were a couple of places that had already, prior to 2020, been engaged in establishing Black studies, but a proliferation happened after May 2020. And so when I wrote the book, I was writing from a place in Canada where there was no Black studies, no official Black studies in any university. By the time the book comes out, there's a proliferation, right? So there's this. So when I look at the book now, and that towards the end there, it's kind of this weird moment because it's like, okay, what happened? And recently I was asked to speak at McGill for their Black History Month opening thing, and I wrote an essay called Why Black Studies Now? I was trying to think about why Black studies now in the Canadian context. And of course, it is very much tied up with the EDI project, the Equity Diversity project. But it's also equally tied up with the fact that if it is offered up as a disciplinary project, it becomes a political demobilizing project. Because as we all know, in the university, your disciplinary identity requires a lot of work of you to guard those boundaries, to decide who is in, who's out, to create the mechanisms for a certain kind of recognition. And you can't do all of that work and be on the streets. You can't do all of that work and be still demanding that the university as an institution transform itself. Because now you become consumed by the rhythm of the institution. You now become responsible for being recognized on the basis of the terms of the institution, for your resources and so on and so forth. So I'm really taken by how quickly, I mean, for 50 years, there was no Black studies in Canada. And by 2023, I can count at least 10 or 15 places that now have Black studies in one shape or form. So this is a phenomenon. The other thing is that the cluster hire is being offered up as if it's Black studies. But because you're a Black scholar hired doesn't mean that you do Black studies. So the kind of stakes around what constitutes doing Black studies beyond the disciplinary stake is also heightened. And so there are, I suspect, um, nobody's told me, and I've now left Canada. It's only been 3 months, but nobody's told me. But I suspect that we will see some significant debates about to arise. Colleague of mine, Rosalind Hampton, who wrote a book on McGill University and racialization there, she's been doing a long-term project on mapping Black studies in Canada in both its official now and unofficial states. And so one of the things that I was writing about in the essay Why Black Studies Now is that, in the mid 1990s when I started my first job, the job that I was hired in was advertised as Black Studies. But I was the one person in the department doing Black Studies at that time. Um, so I had to rethink my own understanding of what constitutes institutional, right? Because up until the point of writing that, the argument that I make in Long Emancipation is that there's no institutional Black studies. But I was actually hired in a job that was titled Black Studies. So there.
I'm still like trying to process and take it all in, and kind of pinching myself that I'm in a room with you, because
Oh.
I've been a long time admirer of your work, and a student of your work. So I have so many questions, and I'm gonna not be that person. I'm gonna just ask one question.
Be that person.
This is my chance. Okay, I will seize my chance. Okay, I will limit it to two questions. My first question, and I'll tell you what this question is coming from. This question is coming from an intellectual struggle and a personal struggle that I have. I'm from Ghana. I grew up in Ghana, moved to the States to go to school, and then read Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother and found it an incredibly difficult text to wrestle with. And that's okay, that's a good thing. And I think that some of the difficulty that I had resurfaces here in the Long Emancipation as well, when you talk about, the sort of the complicit presence of Africans in producing the New World Black. And it's a conversation that's hard to have, but necessary to have. And then you had us read Dion Brand, and that text, as you said, right, begins with the name of the African sort of place, location, identity, community that cannot be remembered. In a lot of my work, I struggle to understand how to think about and with Africa in this production of Blackness in the New World. The ways that I see Africa appear sometimes is an Africa that I don't really recognize from my own experience with it. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how do you think or how would you suggest, or where would you point me to in thinking about Africa, understanding that it's not a homogenous, right? But how to think about the continent in understanding this production of Blackness, in understanding Black life forms as both the kind of the violence that nomenclature gestures to, but also the possibilities that it reclaims, right? How do we think with Africa in this conversation? So that's my first. My second question will be a lot shorter, and I'll tell you again where that question is coming from to situate myself in my question. I'm working on narratives about slavery by enslaved children, and the violence that we've described here is so overwhelming, it overtakes me. And I find that the only way to move through this is to move with love. And so in the Long Emancipation, you talk about the reclaiming of the flesh as a body loved. It's a glimpse of freedom in its kinetic form, where freedom meets love and where love becomes an activating force toward a potential freedom. Indeed, love, a non-material condition, becomes a major context for moving toward freedom. And I see a lot of love in this book, like how you talk about, bodily autonomy, sovereignty, moving, etc. So again, a question about how would you suggest, or where would you point me to learn more about how one might think with love as possibility, as a way of moving towards freedom in the face of violence that can be so overwhelming that sometimes it becomes debilitating.
Mhm.
So those are my two questions.
Yeah, I'll tackle the last one first. I come to that question about love via Toni Morrison, as you know, and Baby Suggs, that amazing sermon that Baby Suggs gives, that Toni Morrison is able to imagine, right? Love your hands because they will cut them off. you know, it's like when you read, when you read Beloved for the first time, and you come to that sermon, if you if you've if you've been thinking about and living the experience of the afterlife of slavery, that sermon knocks you off your feet, right? Um, and I think about this question of love through the poetic works of Kamal Brathwaite, Derek Walcott, um, Louisiana, Jane Louisa will soon come home, Erna Broadbent. Um, I think that Black American writers, Paula Marshall, Black American writers, Caribbean writers, have, and this is something I'm writing about in this essay that I'm working on, called Freedom's Revenge, that they've taken the novel as a form and right, the 18th, 19th century novel as a form, and undo that form to give us an account of Black life in which we can love ourselves in the most profound ways. Um, Tony K. Bambera, Shirley Young Williams, Dessa Rose. Like, we could go on and on. Deion Bryant at the Fallen Change of the Moon. Sonia Chance's poetry, on and on. And we see this with visual artists too, you know. Um, Simone League's monumental statues, and so on. So it's kind of like, but you hit on something about love, and there I call it this kind of non material quality. But it really takes me back to this kind of question of the interiority of our lives, of Black lives, and what can't be made captive. What can't be made captive is our imaginations. Um, can try to interrupt them, can try to limit them in all kinds of ways, but they can't be made captive. And that in of itself is like a really powerful thing to reckon with. And thinking about slave children and slave childhood subjectivity, if we can even call the enslaved a child, right? Because as you know from your research, they weren't necessarily treated like children. They might be a gift to a young white child as a plaything or what. So it's kind of to put childhood after slave is to do something radical, right? It's to reorder both the word slave and what it means and childhood and what it means. Um, which is why we also sometimes then fall into the categories of gender in their most rigid forms, right? Slave man, slave woman, who can be, as we were talking last night, who can be raped and who can't be, and so on. But to put slave and child together is to do something radical already. It's to disrupt both in deeply profound ways. I think that's as far as I can get with that question. On the first question, I think that contemporary African people, and I'm going to use this language now, even though it's not the best language, and New World Black people, that we need Africa in different ways and different kinds of Africas. So yes, I think sometimes when we invoke Africa, we're literally talking past each other. And then I think there are other moments where we meet. Like I think that sometimes for New World Black people, we need Africa as a site of vindication. Um, Earlier, I mentioned Afrocentricity. There are some of us who need, an Africa of great kings and great queens. Um, that vindicates us. That says that, we contributed something to human civilization and so on. And then there's some of us who want to reckon with the fact that people who we understand ourselves to have come from might be engaged in the harm that we have experienced. And we want to make sense of that. We want to make sense of that because without being able to make some kind of sense of that, we can only fall into a kind of story of despair, the kind of melancholia that I want to write against. Um, and in doing that, we invent an Africa. The best example of that is, I think, Rastafari, who not only invent an Africa, but elected Haile Selassie as the king, as the true king. So it's a difficult conversation. It's got lots of ragged edges, but I do think that there are points where it comes together. I think Kigura Macharia, in his book Frottage, does it brilliantly. Um, and hopefully there will be, your work will do this for us too. Hopefully, Barbara's work, hopefully more of us, as we're willing to risk the conversation, right? I think the work of Walter Rodney began some of it for us. Um, you know, I think there are moments in Maya Angelou's trilogy. I know in the Cage Birds Sing and the other, where we see glimpses of what is possible. I suspect, I haven't done this and I don't work as a historian, but I suspect in the papers of people like Stokely Carmichael and Miriam Makeba, we will see these kinds of moments where, let's put it this way, the New World Black meets the African and something gets sorted out. or we learn to live with the antagonisms of the different kinds of Africa we need. Um, found a particular Africa in Algeria, and he died defending it. So estrangement, which I think in some ways underpins the different Africas that we encounter, I think for some New World Black people, the estrangement from Africa is something that we often are not able to fully give voice to. And I think Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother plumbs that estrangement brilliantly, uncomfortably. Um, but there's been this small also body of literature, essay, life writing that has come out of parts of Nigeria where people write about their families or their ethnic clan benefiting from enslavement. That's also been very interesting to me. Um, a kind of African confession that we too participated in the trade. Um, that that I think signals another moment of a potential. I don't think it's necessarily a reckoning, but a potential coming to terms with, right? Because I think the discussion in the piece that I recently published on reparations, I asked the question in that piece whether or not those Africans that benefit from the trade in flesh owe Black people reparations too. Like, and I write that question, but to me it's a profoundly absurd question. Um, but if reparations become an economized, arithmetized project, it's a legitimate question. But I do think so. I think that we have a different set of conversations that we must have um, that might bring us into, that might not bring us in, but might alleviate some of the estrangement that we feel. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but it's definitely it's something I'm grappling with. You know, like how to make sense of what we need from this thing we call Africa that becomes Africa after the fact of this tremendous violence, right? No Africans were being loaded onto the ships. You know, as Vibai Madimbe tells us, Wolof and Yoruba and, you know, who were loaded onto the ships. And the other end, they come out as African and Black.
My name again is Jack. I have a question broadly. It's on the relation of inventiveness to newness, and how we all experience newness, but like differently, right? So, what the relation of Black life is to newness? What particular type of inventiveness is that? I looked back at your chapter on newness and saw a lot of it is about funk. Just curious to hear a little more directly what about funk is about newness to you. And for some context here, I'm thinking about the risks involved in that idea of newness, which is both very valorized, like, oh, you invented something, innovation, new. And then that also often gets called dangerous.
Yeah. So, you know, innovation, that logic of newness that's about innovation and another account of inventiveness is the logic that quickly leads to commoditization. And this is why I think people like to talk about disco having failed, but it's funk music that failed. And you know why it failed? Because it couldn't be commoditized. 300,000 people did not want to go out dressed like Bootsy Collins. or George Clinton. I'm not joking, I'm being very serious. You know, they transformed disco into other things, but funk failed to the extent that funk could not be commoditized in the same way that other black musical forms have been commoditized. There's a reason why, for instance, we now talk about jazz as dead, even though we know jazz is not dead, right? Bam, Black American music. But one of the reasons is because it's hard to commoditize in the same way that R&B or hip hop has been commoditized. And one of the reasons I wanted to work with funk in the book is because funk has so many different meanings within black culture, but also because funk as dance is highly kinetic. You own your body in all kinds of ways. Think about people dancing the funky chicken, the movement of the feet. Um, these things exist beyond the realm of the easily attainable and consumable. That's what black funk is. Um, and anything that stands in significant antagonism to commoditization is rendered useless. I mean, people have returned to Parliament Funkadelic and so on because of the discourse of Afrofuturism. But for a while, I remember in 2010 being in Austin, Texas, and Parliament Funkadelic came through. Yeah, these guys are selling up tiny little places now by then, staying in the extended stay. They're not big musical stars, right? So why does funk wane? It wanes for exactly that reason. It resists a certain kind of commodification. The language of innovation lends itself to commodification. The language of innovation fits very neatly in a kind of linear move of late modern capital. This idea that we keep making new things that perfect something. But funk actually is a throwback to the old, the sweaty, the dirty, um, the sex, all of the things that the society wants but doesn't really want to account for and deal with. We get sweaty and dirty and nasty, and we have sex. All of the things that they say black people do wrong. Funk valorizes those things.
We want to thank Dr. Walcott for this amazing experience. And thank you all so much for coming. And yes, we're so happy to.
Thank you for having me.